Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
Today we have a great story, so let's get started right now.
Usually when we talk about the infrastructure that keeps our modern lives running, we have this very physical mental model in our heads.
Right, yeah, like physical things you can see.
Exactly. Take plumbing, for example. Right. You turn the tap in your kitchen and water flows out because there is a literal physical pipe connected to a municipal reservoir somewhere outside of town.
Yeah, or the electrical grid.
Yes.
I mean, you flip a switch on your wall and power travels along a tangible copper wire from a power plant directly to your living room.
Right. And we trust these systems completely, and we trust them mostly because they obey the basic observable laws of physics.
They're grounded in a tangible reality. There's this deeply comforting predictability to systems where you can, trace the output back to a physical source. You can literally point to the reservoir.
But then you step into the world of money, banking, and the global financial system, and suddenly that whole physical pipe model is completely shattered.
Oh, complete.
I mean, we're looking at an infrastructure that runs the entire planet, right?
Right.
It dictates the rise and fall of nations. It determines whether millions of people have jobs or go hungry, and yet it is almost entirely invisible.
It's the absolute definition of an invisible engine, and what makes it so fascinating and frankly a little terrifying is that the vast majority of people, even highly educated professionals working within the economy, are operating with a fundamentally incorrect blueprint of how this engine actually functions.
Okay, let's unpack this right away.
Yeah.
Because if we are going to understand how this invisible engine dictates your reality, the listener's reality, we have to start by tearing down the biggest myth of all. The way almost everyone visualizes a bank is functionally wrong.
I would argue it's not just wrong, it's dangerously misleading. Like if you stop the average person on the street, or honestly even read most introductory college economics textbooks, and ask them to define what a bank does, they'll describe what economists call the financial intermediary model.
Right, the classic Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life model.
Exactly, the piggy bank concept.
Yeah, like I take my savings, my hard-earned cash from my paycheck, and I deposit it into my local bank. The bank puts my money in a big vault. Then someone else walks into the bank wanting to buy a house, and the bank takes my money out of the vault and lends it to them. The bank is just the middleman taking a little slice of interest for connecting the saver with the borrower.
And that narrative feels so intuitive, right? Because it aligns with our daily experience of physical objects. And in that mental model, banks are just neutral intermediaries. They're pooling existing finite savings and reallocating them. But here's the critical truth we need to establish immediately.
Yeah.
That description applies to a pawn shop.
Wow.
It applies to certain specialist lenders, like a peer-to-peer lending platform, but it absolutely does not describe the mechanics of how modern commercial banks operate.
See, this is the part that completely broke my brain when we started looking into this. Modern commercial banks do not lend out deposits that already exist. They create new deposits out of thin air when they make loans.
Yep.
It's like going to a restaurant where the waiter writing down your order actually materializes the food onto your plate from thin air rather than the kitchen cooking it with existing ingredients.
That analogy captures the sheer absurdity of the mechanic perfectly. I mean, the act of creation is entirely localized to the moment of the transaction.
Right.
When you walk into a commercial bank and they approve you for a $500,000 mortgage, no one goes down to a subterranean vault and wheels out a pallet of cash that belongs to Mrs. Smith or Mr. Jones.
So they aren't transferring existing funds from someone else's savings account into your checking account.
Not at all.
So what is physically happening when I sign those mortgage papers?
The loan officer simply types numbers into a computer.
Just keystrokes.
Just keystrokes. They make a double-entry bookkeeping notation. They record a loan asset on their balance sheet because you now owe them $500,000 plus interest, and simultaneously they create a brand new deposit liability in your checking account. That $500,000 you're about to use to buy the house did not exist anywhere in the universe before the loan was approved.
That is wild.
Yeah.
I feel like we need to anchor this in reality because it sounds like some fringe internet conspiracy theory. People listening might be thinking, there is no way my local bank has the power to just type money into existence.
It does sound like, heterodox economic theory, but it is the explicit operational reality of our global financial system. Central banks usually speak in very dense coded language, but occasionally they pull back the curtain.
Didn't the Bank of England put out a paper about this?
Yeah, in 2014, the Bank of England released a paper explicitly titled Money Creation in the Modern Economy, and it was stunningly blunt.
They actually put it in writing for the public.
They felt they had to, because the textbook misconceptions were leading to terrible policy debates. Bank of England stated in no uncertain terms that commercial banks create money in the form of bank deposits by making new loans.
Wow.
They wrote that when a bank makes a loan, it credits the borrower's account with a deposit of the size of the mortgage, and at that exact moment, new money is created.
Okay, but let's play devil's advocate for a second. Why does this distinction actually matter? If the money spends the exact same at the grocery store, whether it was sitting in a vault for 10 years or created on a keyboard 5 seconds ago, why is this such a crucial paradigm shift for us to grasp?
What's fascinating here is how it completely upends how we understand the limits of the economy. Think about it. If banks are just intermediaries, like the pawnshop model, then the total amount of lending in an economy is strictly capped by how much people are willing to save.
Because the money supply would be fixed.
Exactly. But if banks create money through lending, then the money supply is incredibly elastic. It breathes, it expands rapidly when banks are feeling optimistic and making tons of loans, and it contracts violently when they get scared and stop lending, or when borrowers start defaulting on those loans and the money is literally destroyed.
Wait, so the money supply isn't actually controlled by some dial in Washington? It's largely controlled by the collective mood of commercial loan officers across the country.
Precisely, which means public debates about government debt, inflation, and monetary policy are often completely disconnected from reality because politicians and even some financial journalists are arguing based on a textbook theory that the central banks themselves admit is false.
That is, okay, so if the system operates on typing numbers into a ledger to create reality, how did we get here? It doesn't seem like the kind of thing a group of sober architects would sit down and design from scratch.
They didn't. I mean, the foundational architecture of the modern global economy wasn't handed down by a council of visionary economists. It was a pragmatic, highly profitable accident discovered in 17th century London.
Let's travel back to the 1600s then. We don't have digital ledgers. We don't have the internet. We have very tangible, heavy gold.
Right. So imagine you are a wealthy merchant in London in, say, 1640. You have a massive physical security problem. You've made a fortune in trade. And you now possess chests full of gold and silver coins.
And I can't just leave them in my wooden house, right? They'll be stolen. I need a fortress.
And the people with the best fortresses at the time were the goldsmiths. They needed heavily fortified vaults and armed guards to protect their own raw materials and finished jewelry anyway.
So the goldsmiths started offering a side service. They told the merchants, for a small fee, you can store your heavy metal in our vaults. In exchange, we will give you a customized paper receipt, a promissory note.
Exactly. The note simply said, I promise to pay the bearer of this piece of paper X amount of gold upon demand.
Which is an incredible technological leap in convenience, really. Because if I want to buy a shipment of lumber from you across town, I don't have to hire a wagon and armed guards to transport a heavy chest of gold. I can just hand you the piece of paper. And as long as you trust that the specific goldsmith is solvent, you accept the paper as if it were the gold itself.
That psychological leap is everything. Very quickly, these paper receipts began to circulate independently as a medium of exchange. The paper became the money. Now, put yourself in the shoes of the goldsmith sitting in his shop a few months later.
Okay, I'm looking at my vault full of gold, and I'm realizing something very interesting about human behavior.
Right. You notice that hardly anyone is coming in to redeem the receipts. Because the paper is so convenient to trade in the markets, on any given day, maybe 5% of the depositors show up demanding physical metal.
So the other 95% of the gold is just sitting there in the dark, gathering dust.
And if you're an enterprising business owner, you start to think, what a waste of capital.
So the initial thought is probably, I could lend some of this idle gold out to people who need capital and charge them interest.
But then comes the true aha moment, the financial hack that literally changed world history. The goldsmith realizes he doesn't even need to lend out the physical gold. He can just print more paper receipts and lend those out instead.
even though there is no new gold in the vault to back them up.
Exactly. As long as everyone doesn't show up on the exact same day demanding their physical gold, the goldsmith can issue paper receipts for far more gold than actually exists in his vault.
And this is the birth of fractional reserve banking. They're holding only a fraction of the reserves necessary to cover their outstanding liabilities.
And earning a massive spread in the process. I mean, they might pay a tiny bit of interest to attract deposits, but they're charging substantial interest on the new paper money they are creating out of thin air. The core operational logic of that system hasn't changed in 4 centuries.
So just to make sure I'm grasping the scale of this, you're telling me that the foundational architecture of our entire modern financial system was essentially a 17th century financial hack to fund a war. Wait, no. Originally just a hustle by some jewelers to generate extra yield.
It was absolutely a hustle. A brilliant one, but a hustle nonetheless. And it proved so effective at generating credit that it was soon institutionalized on a massive national scale. The turning point was 1694 with the founding of the Bank of England.
But the Bank of England wasn't created to manage interest rates or inflation like central banks do today, right?
Yeah, no. You have to strip away all modern assumptions about what a central bank is. The Bank of England was born entirely out of a desperate military crisis. King William III was fighting the 9 Years' War against France. Wars are incredibly expensive, the government's tax revenues were exhausted, and the crown's credit was so terrible that no one would lend to them at reasonable rates.
So the government is functionally bankrupt in the middle of a massive conflict.
Then, a syndicate of wealthy London merchants approaches the king with a proposition. They offer to lend the government £1.2 million, an absolutely staggering, nearly unfathomable sum of money at the time. But they have conditions.
Naturally.
In exchange for funding the war, they want a royal charter to operate as a joint stock bank with a massive privilege, the exclusive right to issue banknotes.
They funded a war in exchange for a state-sanctioned monopoly on the goldsmith's fractional reserve magic trick.
And in doing so, they established the eternal template for the global monetary system we still live under today. Think about the symbiosis they created. The government issues debt bonds, which provides the ultra-safe asset base for the banking system. In return, the banking system uses its fractional reserve powers to provide the government with the credit it needs to spend far beyond its immediate tax revenues.
But wait, if the goldsmiths and eventually the banks are constantly printing more receipts than they have gold, what happens the day people get paranoid? Doesn't the whole thing just implode the second people lose faith in the paper?
That is the fatal flaw in the architecture. The system is structurally entirely reliant on an invisible, fragile emotion, which is confidence.
Right.
The business model assumes that everyone won't demand their underlying assets at once. But if a rumor starts, maybe true, maybe false, that a bank has made terrible loans and doesn't have the assets to back its deposits.
A crowd gathers outside the shop. A classic bank run.
The bank run is the nightmare scenario. Because the moment the run begins, the illusion shatters. The bank literally cannot satisfy the demand because it has lent most of the money out. That fragility is not a bug in the code of the financial system. It is a structural feature of the design itself.
And because that inherent structural fragility relies on human emotion, it turns the entire economy into a psychological powder keg. Yeah. When confidence inevitably breaks, it triggers a devastating, predictable psychological cycle.
To really understand the anatomy of these inevitable crises, we have to look at the work of an economist named Hyman Minsky. For a long time, mainstream orthodox economics completely ignored Minsky.
Why did they ignore him? I mean, if he was right.
Because mainstream economics in the mid-20th century was obsessed with equilibrium. They built elegant mathematical models, assuming that markets naturally trend towards stability and balance. Minsky came along and basically said, your models are useless because equilibrium is a myth. The system is inherently unstable. His framework, the financial instability hypothesis, is now considered the ultimate lens for understanding why economies repeatedly blow themselves up.
His most famous phrase is so counterintuitive, stability is destabilizing. How does a long period of peace and quiet actually cause an explosion?
Minsky observed human psychology. When an economy has a long period of quiet, stable growth, no recessions, no bank runs, people get complacent. Asset prices, whether that's real estate, stocks, or commodities, start to slowly, reliably rise. Because they are rising so predictably, people perceive the world as fundamentally less risky.
And when things feel safe, people are more willing to take on debt.
Exactly. Minsky mapped this descent into chaos across 3 distinct stages of finance. Stage 1 is what he called hedge finance. This is the healthy baseline. This is you taking out a 30-year fixed mortgage to buy a house, but your salary as a teacher or a plumber is high enough that you can easily pay both the interest and the principal on the loan every month straight from your current income.
That's just responsible banking. The asset could drop in value, but you can still service the debt.
But as the good times roll on and that house appreciates in value year after year, human greed takes over. Now we slide into stage 2, which is speculative finance. In this stage, borrowers are stretching. They take on so much debt that their monthly income can only cover the interest payments, not the principal.
So they're basically treading water.
They're entirely reliant on the asset, the house continuing to go up in value. The plan is to hold it for a year, let the price rise, and then either refinance the loan or flip the house to pay off the original debt.
I think anyone who was alive in the mid-2000s real estate boom knows exactly what that looks like. Adjustable rate mortgages where people were betting everything on the next appraisal.
It's a tale as old as time, but it doesn't stop there. As the euphoria peaks, we enter stage 3, the terminal stage, Ponzi finance. In Ponzi finance, the borrower's income isn't even enough to pay the interest on the debt, let alone the principal.
Wait, how does that even work mechanically? How do you not default immediately?
The only way a Ponzi borrower survives is by constantly taking out new loans just to make the interest payments on the old loans. They are betting absolute top dollar that the asset price is going to skyrocket forever. It is pure financial hallucination.
And then reality taps on the window.
Yes. This is what we now call the Minsky moment. It's the trigger that breaks the positive feedback loop and shatters the hallucination. It doesn't even have to be a major event. It could be a central bank raising interest rates by 0.25%, making new borrowing slightly more expensive. Or it could just be a collective, unspoken realization that prices have detached from reality. Once the loop breaks, the cycle violently reverses.
Because the Ponzi borrowers can't get new loans, so they have to sell the asset.
And because everyone is a Ponzi or speculative borrower at the top of a boom, everyone tries to sell their assets to pay their massive debts at the exact same time. The market is flooded with sellers and has zero buyers. Prices crash, collateral values evaporate, banks realize their loans are worthless and panic, credit freezes, and the self-amplifying boom becomes a self-amplifying bust.
You see this pattern repeating so relentlessly across history. The Dutch tulip mania in 1637, where people were literally trading their life savings for flower bulbs. The railroad speculation of the 1840s, the Florida land boom in the 1920s. But the one that really illustrates Minsky's model flawlessly is the South Sea bubble of 1720.
The South Sea bubble is the archetype. It perfectly maps onto our modern understanding of crises. The British government, much like in 1694, had a massive, crippling national debt problem for fighting wars. So they struck a convoluted deal with a newly formed entity called the South Sea Company.
What was the mechanical nature of the deal? It wasn't just them selling a stock, right?
No, it was a massive debt for equity swap. The South Sea Company agreed to assume a large chunk of the British government's national debt. In exchange, the government granted the company a total exclusive monopoly on British trade with Spanish South America.
On paper, that sounds incredibly lucrative. A monopoly on a whole continent's trade.
On paper, it sounds like printing money. The reality, however, was that Spain controlled those ports tightly, and they were actively hostile to British merchants. The massive, highly profitable trade empire the company was promising its investors never actually materialized. But that didn't matter in the slightest because the narrative had already outrun the fundamentals.
Because the company allowed people to buy shares on margin.
Which is the definition of Minsky's speculative finance. You didn't need the full amount of cash to buy the stock, you just needed a tiny down payment, and the company itself would lend you the rest. Between January and August of 1720, the share price rose approximately tenfold. It wasn't driven by actual shipping profits or fundamentals. It was driven by sheer speculative momentum, margin debt, and crucial social validation.
Right.
The entire British social elite was buying in. Members of parliament, the aristocracy, the king's mistresses.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because you look at the investor list for the South Sea Company, and it's not just greedy aristocrats. Isaac Newton lost a fortune in this bubble.
It is one of the most incredible footnotes in financial history.
Wait, the gravity guy. Isaac Newton, the man who invented calculus, lost his shirt in a stock bubble.
Yeah, he originally bought in early, made a massive profit, and cashed out. But as he watched his friends continue to get richer and richer as the stock climbed, he just couldn't stand it. He bought back in at the absolute peak. When the Minsky moment hit and the bubble burst, he lost something like 20,000 pounds, which was an astronomical sum in 1720.
Wow.
He supposedly lamented later, "I can calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of the people."
That is just so telling. The literal inventor of the laws of gravity couldn't defy the laws of financial gravity and mob psychology.
Because the vulnerability isn't about intelligence, it's about human psychology. What we need to recognize is that while the underlying asset changes in every cycle, whether it's tulips in Amsterdam, trains in Victorian England, or dot-coms in 1999, the human and structural pattern is identical every single time. It's the fractional reserve system, creating elastic credit, amplifying human greed on the way up, and amplifying human fear on the way down.
And for centuries, society basically just accepted these boom-bust cycles as a natural phenomenon, like a bad winter storm. Every 10 or 20 years, there would be a panic, some banks would fail, people would lose their savings, and then they'd dust themselves off and rebuild. But eventually, one specific crash was so unbelievably catastrophic that it forced humanity to completely rewrite the rules of global finance to stop the Minsky cycle from destroying society.
We're talking, of course, about the Wall Street crash of October 1929 and the decade-long Great Depression that followed. But here's where we need to apply our new mechanical understanding of banking to history. The stock market crash of 1929 was severe, yes. But a stock market crash on its own does not cause a 10-year global economic depression with a 25% unemployment rate.
So what turned a bad recession into an existential crisis?
The policy response, or rather, the lack of one. This was meticulously documented decades later by economists Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, and their findings were later championed heavily by Ben Bernanke long before he became the head of the Federal Reserve. They proved that it was the Federal Reserve's catastrophic misunderstanding of their own system that doomed the economy.
Let's walk through the mechanics of that failure. The stock market crashes. People get scared. What happens next?
Remember the fundamental rule. Loans create money, and bank deposits make up the vast majority of the actual money supply in the economy. After the crash, panic sets in. People realize their local bank might have lent money to stock speculators who are now ruined, so they rush to the bank to withdraw their cash.
The classic 17th century Goldsmith bank run.
And because banks operate on fractional reserves, they physically do not have enough cash in the vault to pay everyone.
Right. Normally, this is precisely why the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. They're supposed to act as the lender of last resort.
Yeah.
The mechanism is simple. If a bank is fundamentally solvent, but just facing a temporary liquidity crisis, the central bank is supposed to lend them emergency cash to pay off the panicked depositors. Once the depositors see the teller has plenty of cash, the panic subsides.
But the Fed didn't do that.
Why? Did they just not care?
They were adhering to incredibly strict, highly conservative economic doctrines of the time. The prevailing wisdom among the central bankers and politicians, like Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, was that the 1920s boom had been a period of sinful excess. They believed the system needed to be purged.
Right.
Mellon famously advised President Hoover to liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. They honestly believed that letting banks fail was a healthy cleansing process for the economy.
So the Fed basically looked at a massive financial fire, and instead of grabbing a hose, they decided to completely shut off the city's water main.
They stood back and let the banks fail, and the numbers are staggering. Between 1929 and 1933, approximately 9,000 American banks collapsed.
So if 9,000 banks failed because people panicked, what happens to all the money that was in those checking and savings accounts?
It ceases to exist. When a bank fails and its loans default, the deposits on the liability side of the ledger are wiped out. Because bank deposits are the money supply, the actual amount of money circulating in the United States contracted by roughly a third. Imagine 1 out of every $3 in the entire economy just vaporizing into thin air.
Which instantly triggers a deflationary death spiral.
Exactly. Walk through the mechanics of a deflationary spiral. Because the money supply is shrunk, there is physically less money available to buy goods, so businesses see their sales plummet. To try and attract rare dollars, they slash their prices. But cutting prices means lower revenues, so they have to fire workers.
And those fired workers can't pay their mortgages.
Which causes more loans to default, which causes more banks to fail, which vaporizes even more money, shrinking the money supply further. And the most vicious part of deflation is that while prices and wages are falling, the real value of your debt stays exactly the same. It becomes mathematically impossible to pay off debts. It's a literal economic death spiral.
It was an unmitigated human disaster. And it became incredibly clear to the Roosevelt administration in 1933 that a modern industrial society could not survive this kind of systemic fragility. So they decided to build a regulatory fortress around the financial system.
Yeah, they passed laws designed to surgically neutralize the two fatal flaws we've been discussing: the Goldsmiths bank run and the Minsky speculative bubble. Let's look at the architecture of that fortress, starting with the first wall, the FDIC.
The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. How'd this solve the 17th century bank run problem?
It was a stroke of pure psychological genius. The government recognized that you can't just outlaw fear, so they changed the incentive structure. The government essentially guaranteed that if your bank failed, the federal government would step in and make sure you got your deposited money back up to a certain limit.
So overnight, it completely removes the rational incentive for a bank run. Even if I hear a rumor that my local bank made a bunch of terrible loans, I don't need to panic and run down to the teller to pull my cash out because the U.S. government is backing my checking account.
Exactly. It severed the psychological link that caused runs. The second wall of the fortress was designed to tackle the Minsky problem. This was the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933.
How does a law stop bankers from getting caught up in a speculative bubble?
It doesn't stop them from wanting to gamble, but it stops them from gambling with depositors' money. Glass-Steagall looked at the banking industry and legally clove it in two. It separated commercial banking from investment banking.
Define the difference mechanically.
Commercial banking is the boring, everyday business of taking deposits and making safe, predictable loans like mortgages and small business loans. This is the side of the bank that gets the FDIC government protection. Investment banking, on the other hand, is the high-risk, high-reward business of trading securities, underwriting stocks, and speculating in markets.
So Glass-Steagall essentially said, you can be a boring commercial bank with government protection, or you can be a high-flying investment bank rolling the dice in the stock market, but you cannot be both in the same building.
Precisely. It prevented a bank from taking a retail customer's FDIC-insured deposits and using that money to gamble on speculative assets. When you add the creation of the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, to enforce transparency, and later the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement, you have constructed a completely new, heavily fortified financial world.
And the most incredible part of this history is that it worked. It actually worked.
It worked flawlessly for decades. From the end of World War II until the mid-1970s, a period economists often call the Great Moderation, there were essentially zero major systemic banking crises in the developed world.
Because banking was boring.
It was incredibly boring. Economists refer to this era as financial repression. Interest rates were capped by law. Capital couldn't easily flow across borders. The industry operated on what they jokingly called the 363 rule.
Wait, what's the 363 rule?
It meant you pay your depositors 3% interest on their savings, you charge borrowers 6% interest on their loans, and you hit the golf course by 3 p.m. Yeah, there was no intense competition, no exotic derivatives. It was less profitable for the bankers, certainly, but it was remarkably, profoundly stable for society.
But memory is a fragile thing. The fortress worked flawlessly for decades. But eventually, people forgot why the walls were built in the first place, leading to a massive ideologically driven demolition project.
By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the U.S. was dealing with stagflation, high inflation, and high unemployment. There was a massive push to deregulate all industries: airlines, trucking, telecom, and eventually finance. And we have to be objective here. There were genuine, coherent economic arguments for this deregulation.
Right. It wasn't just cartoon villains rubbing their hands together plotting to destroy the world. What was the actual economic logic for tearing down Glass-Steagall?
The argument was that the financial repression of the Great Moderation was suffocating the economy. The rigid rules were preventing capital from flowing efficiently to the most innovative companies. The theory was that if you remove the red tape, the free market will allocate capital far more efficiently, creating more growth.
It was a mix of that efficiency argument and a really deep ideological belief that modern markets are inherently self-correcting.
Exactly. The prevailing orthodoxy in the 90s was that modern financial institutions were simply too sophisticated to fail. The belief was that the market could regulate itself better than government bureaucrats could. So, piece by piece, they started dismantling the 1933 fortress.
And the symbolic death blow to the fortress came in 1999.
The Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. This officially repealed the core provisions of the Glass-Steagall Act. It allowed the commercial banks to merge back together with the high-risk speculative investment banks.
It instantly recreated the exact toxic conflict of interest that the 1933 laws were written to prevent. You brought the casino back into the vault.
But the danger wasn't just the mega mergers. The real danger was what was metastasizing in the dark. The rise of what we now call shadow banking.
Shadow banking sounds incredibly sinister, like guys in trench coats trading briefcases of cash. What is it mechanically?
Shadow banking refers to a vast, complex network of financial entities, hedge funds, special purpose vehicles, investment banks, that essentially perform the core mechanical function of a bank, but outside the regulatory view and without any of the FDIC safety nets.
It's basically like driving a high-speed sports car without seatbelts or airbags, purely on the ideological assumption that you are too smart to ever crash.
That's a great way to put it. Traditional banks take deposits and make long-term loans. This is called maturity transformation. You borrow money on a short-term basis, like a checking deposit, and you lend that money out on a long-term basis, like a 30-year mortgage.
But the shadow banks were doing this without retail deposits. Where were they getting the money to fund these massive long-term assets?
They relied on the repo market repurchase agreements. It is overnight lending between massive institutions. A shadow bank might borrow billions of dollars every single afternoon from other institutions to balance their books, and they have to pay it back the next morning and borrow it again.
That sounds like a corporate supply chain running on just-in-time inventory, like a massive car manufacturer that relies on trucks arriving every 10 minutes. If one truck gets a flat tire or a snowstorm hits, the entire assembly line shuts down instantly.
That is the precise mechanical vulnerability of shadow banking. They were doing maturity transformation without a net. And they were using this fragile overnight funding to fuel a classic Minsky speculative bubble, this time in real estate, utilizing a financial alchemy called securitization.
Let's walk through securitization step by step, because this is the actual meat grinder that produced the toxic waste of 2008.
In the old days, under the 363 rule, a local bank gave you a mortgage, and they held that mortgage on their own balance sheet for 30 years. If you defaulted on the loan, the local bank took the loss. Because of that, the bank had a very strong incentive to underwrite the loan carefully.
But securitization completely changes the incentive structure.
Completely. With securitization, a mortgage originator makes the loan, but they have no intention of holding it. They originate thousands of mortgages, and increasingly in the mid-2000s, these were subprime mortgages. The originator sells these thousands of mortgages to an investment bank on Wall Street.
The meat grinder.
The investment bank acts as the grinder. They take thousands of these disparate mortgages, pool them together, and chop them up into massive, complex financial products called mortgage-backed securities, or MBS. Then they pay credit rating agencies to stamp these bundled products with a AAA rating.
And then they sell those bundles off to global investors' pension funds in Norway, municipalities in Germany, hedge funds in New York.
Exactly. The ultimate risk of the borrower defaulting is passed on to some anonymous investor on the other side of the planet.
Which, in theory, was supposed to make the system safer.
Right. That was the mathematical theory, yeah. But the fatal flaw was that the complexity completely obscured who actually held the risk. Because the securitizations were sliced into further derivatives called CDOs, and those were sliced into CDO squareds, no one actually knew which banks were holding the toxic waste.
So when the U.S. housing market finally started to cool down in 2006, borrowers started defaulting. The Minsky moment hits.
It hits hard. And the mechanism of the crash didn't start with lines of retail customers around the block. It started in the shadow banking system. In August 2007, that just-in-time inventory system you described, the overnight interbank repo market completely froze.
Because the trust evaporated.
Exactly. If I don't know if your bank is holding $1 billion of worthless subprime mortgage derivatives, I am absolutely not going to lend you money overnight. I hoard my cash. The trucks stopped delivering the parts to the factory.
And it all culminated in September 2008, when the U.S. government made a fateful decision regarding Lehman Brothers.
There was immense political pressure to stop the bailouts. People were citing moral hazard, the idea that if you rescue risk takers, they'll just take more risks in the future. So the government decided to draw a line in the sand. They let Lehman Brothers fail.
But letting Lehman fail was the systemic heart attack.
It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Because Lehman was deeply interconnected with every other institution on the planet through millions of derivative contracts, their collapse proved that absolutely no one was safe. It triggered a wholesale global run on the shadow banking system. We were staring directly into the abyss of a second Great Depression.
But this time, the central bankers at the wheel had read their history books. Because they remembered 1929, they knew they couldn't just shut off the water main this time. They had to flood the entire world with money.
And that brings us to the most massive, unprecedented monetary experiment in human history. Ben Bernanke was the chairman of the Federal Reserve in 2008, and he was a scholar of the Great Depression. He knew how to save the money supply.
So they grabbed the biggest fire hose they could find. They cut interest rates to near zero. But it wasn't enough, right?
No, it wasn't nearly enough. Once rates are at zero, conventional monetary policy is basically out of ammunition. So the Fed launched quantitative easing, or QE.
Walk us through the mechanics of QE. How does a central bank physically execute it?
Quantitative easing is essentially the central bank deciding to forcefully expand the money supply by acting as a massive buyer of assets in the open market. The central bank creates new reserves, new digital money, literally out of thin air on their own ledger. They then use this newly created money to buy safe assets, primarily government bonds, from commercial banks.
Wait, so they just invent it and inject it straight into the veins of the banking system, and the scale of this intervention over the next decade is just hard to comprehend.
The numbers defy normal human intuition. Between 2008 and 2022, the major global central banks, the Fed, ECB, Bank of England, Bank of Japan, collectively expanded their balance sheets from about $3 or $4 trillion to over $25 trillion.
They summoned over $20 trillion into existence. Let's break down how this works mechanically, through the signaling channel and the portfolio balance channel.
The signaling channel is psychological. By announcing they're going to buy trillions of dollars in bonds, the central bank is violently signaling to the market, we are the buyer of last resort. Do not panic.
And the portfolio balance channel.
This is the critical mechanical effect. When the central bank buys up trillions of dollars of safe government bonds, it creates massive demand for those bonds. Their price goes up, and their yield, the interest rate they pay out, goes down. The central bank effectively crushed the yield on safe investments down to almost nothing.
How does that force money to move?
Imagine you manage a massive pension fund. You're legally obligated to make an 8% return every year. Historically, you could achieve a lot of that just by holding safe government bonds, but now those bonds yield 1%. You are mathematically forced to take your capital out of safe bonds and hunt for yield in riskier assets, like corporate bonds, real estate, and the stock market.
The central bank is literally forcing capital out of the safe harbor and into risk assets. So, objectively speaking, what were the results of this grand experiment?
The objective mechanical consensus is this. QE undeniably succeeded in its primary defensive mission. It stopped the deflationary death spiral. However, its transmission into the real economy, meaning actual business investment and wage growth, was incredibly modest.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? How did this incredibly obscure central banking mechanism affect everyday reality? Because we need to look objectively at the distributional consequences of QE, purely as a mechanical economic fact.
Right, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, mechanically, QE massively inflated the prices of financial assets. Stocks, real estate, corporate bonds all soared to historic highs. Therefore, the people who overwhelmingly benefited from QE were the people who already owned those assets.
The wealthy. Because if you don't own a stock portfolio, QE didn't make your net worth go up.
Exactly. It did very little for those relying on labor income. In fact, buying a house became increasingly out of reach as real estate prices skyrocketed. So, purely as a mechanical side effect of saving the banking system, central banks drastically accelerated wealth inequality.
And that stark inequality, combined with the sheer scale of the 2008 bailouts, deeply fractured public trust in government money. From the ashes of that broken trust, a completely new, rebellious vision of money was coded into existence.
This is where the history of money takes its most radical pivot. In early 2009, a pseudonymous programmer operating under the name Satoshi Nakamoto launched the Bitcoin network. And it is vital to understand that Bitcoin was a direct philosophical response to the 2008 bailouts and fractional reserve banking.
It's essentially an anti-system. Nakamoto designed Bitcoin to have a mathematically fixed, absolute maximum supply of 21 million coins. It cannot be inflated by a central committee.
Exactly. Bitcoin removes the institutional intermediary entirely. It uses a decentralized peer-to-peer network and a public blockchain. You don't need to trust a bank executive. You only need to trust the cryptography.
And because of pseudonymity, no government or bank can seize it. But then you have the central bank counter move, right? Central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, currently in development in over 100 countries.
A CBDC is essentially the central banking establishment taking the underlying technology of digital ledgers and using it to centralize the system even further. A retail CBDC would allow you, the everyday citizen, to hold a digital currency account directly on the ledger of the central bank itself.
Wait, if a CBDC means I could just bank directly with the Federal Reserve, doesn't that basically make the entire commercial banking system obsolete? Why would we even need the middleman anymore?
This raises an important question, and it is the exact existential terror commercial bankers are feeling right now. If everyone moves their money to the central bank, commercial banks lose their deposit base and their ability to do fractional reserve lending.
But holding your money directly at the central bank eliminates bank runs forever. We wouldn't even need the FDIC.
But that ultimate systemic stability comes with a terrifying societal trade-off. If the central bank manages every single retail account, it means the government has direct, real-time visibility into every single transaction you make.
The ultimate financial efficiency versus terrifying state surveillance. Whether the future belongs to decentralized crypto or centralized CBDCs, how we talk about these financial systems will determine who holds the power. The vocabulary we use is not neutral.
This is a crucial point. We focus on the math, but the specific words we use encode deep social and political assumptions. After 2008, words like too big to fail, moral hazard, and contagion went mainstream.
Let's analyze the word bailout. It carries an implicit moral criticism. It feels like you're rescuing a gambler from their own bad bets.
Exactly. Now compare that to the vocabulary the regulators prefer. They call the exact same mechanical action a stabilization program or a liquidity rescue.
It's the fundamental difference between telling the public we are going on a heroic rescue mission versus we are forcing you to pay off a billionaire's casino debts.
And looking at this impartially, you can see how both sides use this framing to push different agendas regarding who bears the costs of risk. This is why financial literacy isn't just about math, it's about language. Understanding these terms gives you the power to participate intelligently in public discourse without being manipulated by framing.
So we've gone on an incredible journey from 17th century goldsmiths handing out paper receipts, to Isaac Newton losing his shirt, to central banks printing trillions, to the digital ledgers of tomorrow.
Right, the whole spectrum.
You now possess the mental models to see the matrix of money, to spot a Minsky moment in the wild, and to decode the news. But I want to leave you with a completely new question to ponder. If Hyman Minsky's boom-bust cycles are based on human psychology, optimism, and panic, what happens to the global financial system when artificial intelligence and algorithms begin conducting the majority of transactions on these new digital ledgers?
That is a wow.
Can an algorithm experience irrational exuberance, or will AI create a totally new, unrecognizable type of financial crisis?
It's a chilling thought. Replacing the human psychological engine with a silicon one? We have no idea what systemic risks that will generate.
It's something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the invisible systems around you.